Good morning. It is Tuesday, the 19th of May. I'm Maeve McMahon, and this is Europe Today, your daily dose of European news and analysis, live here on Euronews. Coming up, US President Donald Trump has said he is holding off on a military strike on Iran as Gulf countries told him serious negotiations are taking place. His comments come as G7 finance ministers and central bank governors gather in Paris amid rising concern over the economic fallout from the Middle East conflict. And in a nod to farmers across Europe, Brussels will unveil its so-called fertiliser action plan today. The €1 million plan will be funded by leftover CAP funds and aims to support farmers facing a blockage of fertiliser supplies in the Strait of Ormuz. But many farmers are concerned and are demanding an exemption from the EU's carbon border tax rules. Plus, MEPs gather in Strasbourg today to, among other things, try to, quote, Trump-proof the EU-US Turnberry trade deal. The heat is on since the US president threatened new tariffs on European cars, and EU capitals are nervous about strong safeguards in case Washington retaliates. We'll be live in Strasbourg. But we can start with that G7 finance ministers meeting taking place today in Paris, where the US Treasury Secretary has already sparked concern after announcing a pause in sanctions on Russian oil exports. The talks come as investors remain nervous about inflation, higher borrowing costs and the long-term economic impact of the war. For the latest, we're joined here in the studio by our Maria Today, our Europe editor. Maria, these meetings take place at a very crucial time for the European economy. What can be achieved really today?
Well, yes, for the European economy, but also the global economy, because we still see the ramifications from the situation in the Middle East and, of course, the Strait of Ormuz, which is far from operating normally. Now, for this meeting is day two. This is, just to set the scene for our viewers, an elite gathering of G7 ministers, G7 central bankers. The head of the European Central Bank, Christine Lagarde, will also be there, and the boss of the Eurogroup. On the agenda, there's a number of issues which go from trade to sanctions to, of course, China. Increasingly, trade tensions between the European Union and the Chinese are palpable. But to start with the sanctions, yesterday, as you mentioned, the United States once again confirming and announcing that they will extend this waiver on Russian oil. That means that Russian oil that is at sea, that is in transit, countries will be able to buy it and not be in breach of U.S. sanctions. So that is significant in terms of what the U.S. is hoping to achieve, which is to ease some of the concerns of the supply, but also to bring down some of the price pressures because of the instability in the Middle East. The flip side is that Russia will financially benefit from this decision, which will be in place for the next 30 days. For the Europeans, this is bad news, and it is a blow to their strategy because it means, yes, once again, sanctions will be eased on Russian energy. The Europeans argue it's the complete opposite. The strategy should be totally radically different. This is the time to increase the pressure on the Russians and not allow them to cash in on global instability. But the U.S. seems to be concerned, as I mentioned, with global supply. They say they're also doing this, quote, for vulnerable nations that are now feeling the heat because of the war. Of course, obviously, the war is led by the U.S., Israel versus Iran. And they also argue that it will stop China from stockpiling the oil that is available for the Europeans. However, it is a blow to their strategy when it comes to the sanctions. The other issue that will feature heavily is China and the Chinese overcapacity. We've talked about this on the show repeatedly on Euronews. For the Europeans, this is key. They believe that the Chinese, with this massive overload in capacity, a lot of that could be, quote, dump, which is not a very polite term, but the idea is that they will now try to relocate some of their extra production to Europe. That could have an impact on the European industry not being able to compete on the same terms. We spoke on Euronews with the Commissioner for Trade, who said that the EU will not allow this, that they will fight and really fight hard for every industry and every job. And at the same time, you're seeing increasingly more defensive measures from the Europeans. The Financial Times, of course, yesterday reported that the EU could be prepared to intervene the supply chain. And there's also been reports that the EU will seriously now consider plans to diversify suppliers coming into Europe. So a lot of that will feature heavily in this meeting.
Pretty high stakes meeting. And this meeting comes, of course, as Vladimir Putin, the Russian president, is on his way to Beijing. But just tell us as well, speaking of energy, we've seen Italy's Giorgia Meloni upping the ante over deficit rules here in Brussels.
Well, she has. And these two stories, of course, are connected because energy prices, we've seen now more than 3 months of elevated energy prices. The Strait of Ormuz is a crucial point for global oil and is still far from, as I mentioned, operating normally. All of that is having trickle-down effects on the European industry. For a country like Italy, really is the SMEs, it's the small and medium companies that are the backbone to this country. This is having a serious impact, and the Italian Prime Minister is facing an election next year too. So she's now sending a letter, which hopefully we can put up on the screen. Maeve, everyone in Brussels got a copy of this letter yesterday. It was leaked all over the place. So really the Italians wanted to send a big message with this. What they argue is that this is an emergency. Is just as important as defense. This is critical for Europe, and they call on the Commission to relax their fiscal rules. Remember, for European countries, every year they have to keep their deficit below 3%. What Giorgia Meloni argues is that unless there is an easing on those rules, unless there's an exemption to measures related to energy, well, Italy will go above the 3%, or if they don't want to do that, they will not be able to play into a massive defense program that the EU wants, that the Commission wants, which is the SAFE. So she's really saying, if you want me to play ball on defense, you need to help me out on energy. A lot of that, the Italians feel their concerns have not been addressed properly by Brussels, and all of this is happening in anticipation of a European Leaders Summit. We now see that the Italian leader is saying either we get flexibility on energy or this is going to have an impact on defense. We cannot spend for everything. The problem, however, is Brussels says in order to put forward extraordinary measures, you need to have a severe economic downturn. But the EU is not quite there yet. There is a risk of stagflation, but we've not seen a massive recession manifest.
OK, Maria Seo, thank you so much for that analysis. And you can catch more of Maria's analysis on her brand new newsletter that is called Off the Record. But now we can take you to the French city of Strasbourg, where MEPs are meeting for a routine voting session. Tough talks are set to take place late into the night about whether or not to rubber stamp that controversial EU-US trade deal. For a refresher first, though, to hear what's at stake, here's our Jacobianis.
Hey, what you doing tonight at 9 p.m? Maybe going for a date? If so, better fought for European lawmakers and diplomats locked tonight in a room in Strasbourg, desperately trying to prevent an all-out transatlantic trade war. And the clock is ticking down to an unforgiving 4th of July deadline set by Donald Trump, who has threatened a 25% tariff on European cars if Brussels refuses to accept his terms. Alright, so how did Europe end up in this mess? Last July, Trump and Ursula von der Leyen struck a trade deal in Scotland. And the maths looked simple. Zero tariffs on US industrial goods against a 15% cap on European exports. And all of that was built to protect a relationship with almost 1.7 trillion euros. And that's a lot of zeros. But now the European Parliament is pushing back. After a US Supreme Court ruling against the tariffs, Washington introduced new duties on steel and aluminium, effectively violating the treaty before signature. And European lawmakers argue Europe cannot be bullied, so they are baking 3 defensive shields into the text. The known as Sunrise Clause stalls the deal until Washington drops these steel duties. And there is also the Sunset Clause, which automatically ends the agreement in March 2028, so just before Trump leaves office. Finally, there is also the Greenland Clause, allowing Brussels to suspend everything if Trump threatens European territorial integrity again. And quite predictably, this has split Brussels. The centre-right EPP wants a quick deal to avoid industry chaos, but the socialists are digging in. And top European Parliament negotiator Bernd Lange insists European legislation must not be dictated by threats from Washington. So if negotiators reach a compromise tonight, the text heads to a plenary vote in June. But if the deadlock holds, this massive trade relationship hits a cliff edge. And that 4th of July deadline will bring a wave of American tariffs straight to Europe's doorstep. So if you are going on a date tonight, you now have a perfect icebreaker topic. And no, you don't have to thank me for that.
Jacob Yanis there. Well, our correspondent in Strasbourg, Vincenzo Genovese, has plans for tonight. He'll be covering these crunch talks for Euronews, and he's standing by for us this morning in the very European Parliament in Strasbourg. So good morning, Vincenzo. Just tell us, it is make or break time now for the EU-US trade deal. Tell us more.
It is, Maeve. Good morning from Strasbourg. As you said, as you explained, clock is ticking, pressure is mounting from the US administration to get this deal done, but there are still some clauses, some details to fix, and we are here with Juliana Zovko, who is one of the people who will be in the room. She's the negotiator from the European People's Party. Why is taking so long?
But we must understand that we are here represented by different political groups. So on one hand, I'm representing European People's Party, the centre-right party that is pro-business, jobs-orientated, and it's trying to save European industry and European jobs and to give them certainty by making this deal done and by closing this deal. But on the other hand, you have groups who are really advocating ideological fight on the other side of the ocean, which I'm strictly against. And we are having all these geopolitical changes being a part of the deal, which is not from the start meant to be. So the prolongation, extension is despite our will, despite the will of European People's Party.
The socialists are trying to stick to stricter clauses, let's say like this. Okay, but US President Donald Trump said there is a deadline for July. After this, much higher tariffs. So do you feel the pressure?
But that's a part of the interpretation how this European Union is treating the deal that was done in August last year. I mean, if I was an American, I would also be confused about our side of respecting the deal, because Americans have started his part immediately. The process is much more simple, but the complex procedure that is completely acceptable from this side, and all this legislative procedure is taking a long time. And ideological fight, as I already said, in what is going on in the United States. We, European People's Party, wanted this deal done immediately, but I'm afraid we cannot do it on our own.
But do you feel confident for tonight? I mean, what are the most contentious points? I know it's a difficult question.
I mean, I felt confident yesterday. It's like the weather in Brussels or here in Strasbourg. It changes, every hour. And by the news that I'm receiving, I'm also receiving different messages from my colleagues. And I'm not so confident this morning by the.
What did it change?
No, but I haven't seen that the position has changed, so we will see. We have a shadows meeting, and I will discuss with my colleagues how serious we are to enter into negotiations to get this deal done tonight.
But what happens if you can't strike a deal? I mean, this is one of the last chances to get the deal done and for it to be approved in June plenary session, so to match Trump's deadline.
What will happen? It will happen a perfect storm. For our industry, for our jobs, for our tourism. I'm from Croatia. Everything will, spiral from German car industry to Italian cheese industry, wine and everything to Croatian tourism industry. The perfect storm will happen, and then the consequences will be clear who will be paying it. And from the start, I was saying I was for our part of the deal to be respected, and I'm not responsible for a perfect storm we are running into.
Okay, let's hope not. Juliana Zovko, thank you very much and good luck, I think. I think you need it. Maeve.
Of course, good luck. We'll all keep a very close eye on whether that does end out to be a perfect storm and report it here on Euronews. But Vincenzo, before you go, tonight today will also be taking a moment out to hand out the so-called European Order of Merit Prize. It goes to a figure who's been working towards pushing EU values and integration. There's some well-known figures up for the prize. Tell us more.
Yes, indeed. European Parliament President Roberta Metsola will honour the laureates of the European Order of Merit. 20 prominent European figures have been selected, including Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, Moldovan President Maia Sandu, former Polish President Lech Walesa. There are also the Irish rock band U2, that you know very well, and basketball player Giannis Antetokounmpo. But the most controversial name is probably former German Chancellor Angela Merkel. We know her legacy is quite disputed. She has been a stabilizing force during her 16 years in power. She was a reassuring presence. Indeed, Germans nicknamed her Mutti, which means mom. But she had also, let's say, dark sides. For example, the debt crisis, Germany's interdependence with Russia, the appeasement towards Vladimir Putin after the annexation of Crimea in 2014, the shutdown of nuclear energy was also a contentious point, and Commission President Ursula von der Leyen criticized it like in the past months. So opinions are quite divided on Merkel's legacy, and it will be very interesting to see how the hemicycle will react today to her brief address here in the plenary in Strasbourg at 11:30. Okay. And of course, we will follow it on Euronews, Maeve.
We will indeed. A long morning and night for you there in Strasbourg, Vincenzo Genovese. Thank you so much for that live update. But now, back in Brussels, exactly 25 years ago, EU member states agreed to set up an EU military committee to respond initially to the Balkan conflicts of the 90s. And this week, EU chiefs of defence from all across Europe will be flocking to Brussels to celebrate. But souring the mood, of course, will be the ongoing war in Ukraine and the conflict in the Middle East. For more, I'm joined here in the studio by General Sean Clancy, that's the chairman of the EU Military Committee. Good morning. Lovely to have you with us. So this week, as I said, chiefs of defence will be flocking to Brussels to celebrate. But are you all on the same page when it comes to the threats facing the Union today?
Oh, very much so. I think flocking into celebrations, I think it's a moment of reflection more than celebration. I think it's a time to pause and reflect how far the European Military Committee, but the European paradigm of security and defence has come as a whole over that period of time. No more so in the last 4 years, and you've mentioned it, Ukraine, which is the number one priority for all of us and the focus of everyone. Although we do come from the geographical spaces throughout Europe, so it's north, south, east and west, and we take all of these things into consideration. But Ukraine, of course, is the primacy and the priority on which we examine it. And this week, of course, with the chiefs of defence, we will be looking at shaping the challenges that influence all of us. What our responses are to that, and through our reflections in our meetings, then we will be looking at the key issues such as the European security strategy, the defence readiness, and primarily then, of course, Ukraine, where we will be joined by General Syrski from Ukrainian forces himself.
And you just mentioned Ukraine this morning, reports of 500 drones, dozens of missiles being fired into Ukraine. A serious escalation in the last couple of days there. Does this forum, though, carry any weight?
Well, this isn't serious escalation. This, unfortunately, is happening on a regular basis. And the extraordinary resilience of the Ukrainian armed forces, but the Ukrainian people as a whole has transformed Ukraine into a fortress nation now. And Ukraine, from a European point of view, is integral to the future security of Europe. So this isn't just beneficiaries of European charity. This is strategic initiative and imperative for Europe.
But can the EU ever transition to this military powerhouse?
The EU doesn't have to transition to a military powerhouse. Let's be very clear. The defence and deterrence of the Euro-Atlantic area, the responsibility for this lies with NATO. Europe brings huge strength in terms of military advices, in terms of economic power, industrial power, and its ability then through its common security and defence policy instruments, to bring stability, security to many areas. We've seen it in the Western Balkans, which was the initial, I suppose, start out through Concordia of the EU Military Committee way back 25 years ago. But since then, when we reflect on what the EU has done, we'll see it in the Middle East through what the EU is trying to do in terms of the Lebanon going forward with the withdrawal of UNIFIL. We see it in terms of our missions and operations, 15 of which we have completed in the last 25 years. Currently, there are 9 live missions and operations. And the power of the EU is exercised, for instance, through our EU military assistant mission, where we have trained 93,000 soldiers of the Ukrainian armed forces to date. And we will continue unrelentingly doing this, and we will shape the future of the armed forces of Ukraine with the help of the 27 member states working coherently together.
Okay, Sean Clancy, thank you so much for coming into us today
You're
on
welcome,
your
Maeve.
news on Europe Today. And for all other news and analysis on what's going on today in Strasbourg and across Europe, do visit euronews.com or reach out to us at europetoday@euronews.com. Take care and see you soon on Euronews.